I have a question for you. How do you explain the unexplainable in your life? How do you explain the unexplainable in your life? What do you do when the impossible happens? A God thing, yeah, but here's the deal. We have these options. So the impossible becomes possible, and we don't always understand it. For many of us, if we can't explain it, we wonder if it's really true. So how do we explain the unexplainable? Well, we're looking at a story for the next 3 weeks called Jonah, and I believe that no matter where you're at in life, if you've grown up in church, or maybe this is your first time in a church building, this is one of those stories most of us have probably heard. We've probably heard the story of Jonah, and the little bit we know is it has to do with some guy being swallowed by some fish because he ran from God. But for many of us, that story seems impossible. We can't explain it. And so because we can't explain it, many of us will just say, well, I don't know if it really happened. And so we'll just attribute it to some myth or just kind of some story with a deeper meaning. But what if? What if simply because we can't explain it, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen? I would think there's all kinds of things in your life that happen that are not explainable. That the impossible has become possible. What do you do with it? Because I agree with you that this story is impossible. It is. The survival manual for the Army talks about survival in threes. That humans normally can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. So you're right. Jonah should have died. This is simply impossible. But what if? What if God made this possible? Either it's completely made up, either it's a myth, just this legend that people told to try and tell a deeper meaning, maybe to scare people away from running from God. I mean, what's behind this story? Or was it a moment where God takes over? Was it a moment where God intervenes and says, look, Jonah, you're running, but I'm not going to let you get away. And that God was going to do whatever it took to get him back, whatever it took. Now, if you believe in God, and I know not all of you may, but if you do believe in a God who created, who opened his mouth and spoke into existence everything that you see, that he spoke the stars, he spoke the solar system, he spoke and land and water separated, he spoke that into existence. He spoke humans into existence. If we can believe that, couldn't he use a fish? I mean, couldn't he use a fish to do something crazy? Because I'm going to agree with you that this story is crazy, that it seems impossible. But the only reason that it's possible is because God has intervened. Now, I believe this is your story, and I believe this is my story. That if we were to go back and look at our life, there's probably moments where we think, that wasn't possible, and the only reason I am here today is because God intervened. The only reason I'm alive, the only reason I'm still married, the only reason my kids still talk to me, the only reason I still have a job, the only reason is because God intervened at some point. That the impossible became possible. The fact that you're in this room today, that the fact that you're giving church one more try, that you haven't given completely up on God, is because God has intervened and he is intervening. And this is what's happened for Jonah. The impossible can happen. And so you have to wrestle today with this idea is, how can I explain this? And if I can't explain it, could it still be true? I was at a small conference in South Carolina a couple of years ago, and it was only about 200 people, and each afternoon you would break off into small groups. And I was struggling with some things. My wife had a miscarriage not too long before that, and we were pregnant again, or my wife was pregnant again, with our son, Cademan. And she was having lots of complications and lots of issues, and it seemed like every time that Heather went in, they found something different, and they were watching things, and she was constantly having to go in. And I was really struggling with it. I was thinking, all right, is this going to happen again? Are we going to miscarry again? And so I had to leave, and I went to this conference, and I was really struggling, and I was struggling with some of my own personal things of growing up and my relationships as a kid. And so I was attributing those things to God, and I was thinking, all right, God, you're going to be faithful here? Are you going to do something here? And I promise, it was one of the darkest moments for me spiritually. And we get into this small group, and the guy who was leading the small group is going around. He's wanting feedback about what we're learning and what we're thinking. And he comes to me, he says, how's it going? And I just kind of say, it's not going really how I thought it would be. I'm really struggling right now. Now, he did something that seems very weird. And if you've been in church, maybe you've heard the idea of someone saying something prophetic. Jonah was a prophet, and what that meant was he would hear from God, and they would communicate to people what God was saying, often because people couldn't hear from God at times, for whatever reason. So for whatever reason, there might have been this barrier between me and God where I just wasn't listening. And so he chose to use this man who didn't know me to speak something into my life. And he said this. And he said, unborn baby, faithfulness, and unanswered prayer. The guy doesn't know me, doesn't know my wife's pregnant, didn't know we had a miscarriage, didn't know there were medical things, not at all. And in that moment, I just start to weep. And so you hear that and you think, that doesn't make sense. You can't explain it. I can't explain it, and you're right. But this is what I know, that in that moment, God chose to intervene for me. He chose to intervene for me, and in that moment, I felt closer to God than I had ever felt. God intervenes. And this is what happens in Jonah's life, and this is what's wanting to happen in your life and in my life. So just really quick, in case you weren't here last week, maybe you don't know the story of Jonah, this is what happens. God looks at Jonah and says, go to Nineveh. Now, we talked a little bit about Nineveh last week. The people of Nineveh were not nice people. They became experts at skinning people alive, and they could keep them alive longer than anybody else. Yeah, kids in here, you like that? That's what's going on in Nineveh. And God says, look, Jonah, go to Nineveh and tell them to stop what they're doing. Tell them to stop, and that God is going to intervene. So God says go, and Jonah says no. God says go, and Jonah says, no, I'm not going to go. Not only does Jonah say, no, I'm not going to go, but Jonah then runs from God. He runs from God. And this is what's interesting. It's the scripture, the story doesn't say that Jonah runs from Nineveh. It says that Jonah runs from the presence of the Lord. Jonah basically says, look, I don't want anything else to do with you, God. I'm done. I'm running away. And so he goes down to Joppa, which is in around Jerusalem, and he gets on a boat and he sails to Tarshish, which is about as far as you could possibly go. You could say that Jonah ran from God to the ends of the earth. He wanted nothing to do with God. God intervenes and he sends a storm. Jonah's asleep at the bottom of the boat, and the sailors begin to be afraid. They had storms, but this storm was stronger than any storm they had encountered. And so they begin to pray to their own gods, and they literally throw stuff overboard. They begin to throw cargo over the ship because they wanted to save their lives. We talked about this. Your no's to God carry consequences to somebody. Your no, your not yet, your pause on God causes consequences. And these sailors are dealing with Jonah saying no. So the storm comes stronger and stronger. They go down and they wake Jonah up and they say, Jonah, you've got to call out to your God. We've tried, nothing's happening. You have to call out to your God. Maybe he will save us. So they draw straws to see whose fault it is, and it comes short for Jonah. And Jonah in that moment says, look, it's my fault. I'm running from God. And the sailors say, well, what do you suggest that we do? And Jonah says, throw me off the ship. The sailors fight it. They row as hard as they can, but there's nothing they can do. They throw Jonah into the sea. And it ends with this, Jonah 1:17 in the end of Jonah. But the Lord, we talked about this heavy last week. Hopefully you went away thinking about that. But the Lord. Earlier it says, then the Lord sends a storm. But the Lord intervenes, provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. But the Lord intervenes on behalf of Jonah and says, Jonah, you're not going to get away from me. I'm coming for you. Now, I don't think that God was coming to punish Jonah. I think God was coming to get Jonah back. He knew that Jonah was running from him. So he's going to do all he could to get him back. So, we said this last week. Hopefully you wrote this down, thought about it this week. Jonah can run from God. You can run from God. You get to make that choice. God can tell you not to do something, and you get to choose to do it or not. God can also tell you to do something, and you can do it or not do it. Actually, the half-brother of Jesus, his name's James, he writes this in James 4. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. We often think, all right, I'm good with God because I'm just not doing what I'm not supposed to do. But James says, wait. If you know you should do something and you don't do it, then that's considered a sin. Jonah knows what he should be doing and doesn't do it, so much so that he runs. But the Lord intervenes. And so you may find yourself running today. You might find yourself at a place where you want nothing more to do with God. You're here because someone wants you to be here. You're just kind of checking the mark that you came to church on a Sunday. But honestly, you might just be running from God, and you're running from His presence. You might be involved in something that you feel God is saying, stop doing. And you're running from that and doing what you want to do. He has said to go, and you have literally said no. Again, you can run from God. However, Jonah could not outrun God. You cannot outrun God. And God is not looking to punish you. He's not looking to come after you to get you. He's looking to come after you to get you back. He will relentlessly pursue Jonah, and he will relentlessly pursue you. But I think what often happens is more than just running. I think we hit pause. I think we hit pause on our relationship with God. And we say things like, you know what, God, I'll come back. Let me get through high school. Let me get through high school. Let me do what I want to do through high school. I'm going to hit pause, and then I'll come back. Or just let me get through college. Let me live the college life. Let me do what I want to do. When I'm done with college, I'll hit the play, and I'll come back. God, I just got to make a few business decisions. I got to do what I need to do to make money. And so we hit pause. And a few days go by, and a few weeks go by, and a few months go by, a few years go by, and we realize that the pause is still on with God. Look, we play it, we come, but we're not really in the presence of God because at some point we decided to run. This is what Jonah's doing, and God says, you're not going to get away. You're not going to get away. All right, so let's dive into chapter 2 of Jonah. If you don't own a Bible, there should be a red one around you. We'd love to give that to you. You can mark your own Bible. I'm going to tell you a few things to really circle, to underline, to write down as we go through this. We'll go through this verse by verse. Here we go, Jonah 2, verse 1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. And this is what I thought. Yeah, he did. Yeah, I bet, right? I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but there's a saying that there's no atheist in a foxhole. That's not necessarily literal, but it's this idea that when you're stressed, when you're in fear, when there's worry, when everything goes wrong, there's this thought, well, maybe I should go to the higher power. Look, the sailors, they were not Jewish, so they didn't know the living God that we talk about. But even in their moment, they're calling out to some God. Something to intervene, something to save them. So yeah, I bet Jonah prayed. I bet he prayed to the Lord. And so what about you? Is this your first thought when something goes wrong? That immediate you think, man, I've got to go to God. I've got to turn to the Lord. Something's happened that's been unplanned. Finances are tough. You've lost a job. Your parents have found out what you've been involved in. Your spouse knows what's been going on. Something happens, and is your first response in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the chaos, to turn to God? Jonah has made these decisions to put himself in this fish. It is Jonah's decisions that have put him there. You may want to write this down. Your decisions will often lead to your position. Your decisions will often lead to your position. Where you find yourself right now, you may be able to look back and say, look, I made this decision and this decision and this decision, and that's why I am where I am. The storm I'm facing, the difficulty I'm in is because I have made these decisions. It was Jonah's fault. And so in the midst of knowing it's Jonah's fault, he decides, I should probably turn to the one who is relentlessly pursuing me. But when did this happen? Like, when does this happen for Jonah? Does this happen for Jonah when he says, look, you should throw me over the boat, and the sailors say, okay? Does it happen for Jonah in that moment where he says, oh man, I better begin to turn to God? Or was it when they actually grab him and they start swinging him back and forth, getting ready to throw him over the ship? Is it on the way in? Is it when he hits the water? Is it when he's in the water and he's treading water and he's starting to swim to sea and he sees this shadow coming? Is it when he finds himself in the belly of this fish? I mean, when is it? Is it when it gets as bad as it could possibly get that Jonah decides to turn to God? I don't know. When is it for you? I mean, do you have to hit bottom before you'll realize, all right, I should probably realize this is partly my fault, and I should probably turn back to God? Because I don't know if Jonah prays this prayer the first minute he's in the well, or is it day 3 when he finally gives up and he surrenders? It's like Jonah waves the white flag and he says, all right, God, I'm done. I'm done. Have you hit that point yet? Have you got to the point where you need to surrender? Because I'll tell you what I often do, and I'll tell you what I know a lot of you often do, is we blame God. Well, we don't necessarily turn to God, but we begin to say, why, God? Why, God, are you allowing this storm? Why is this happening in my life? Why is everything going wrong? Why, God? Why are you not doing something? Jonah may have done that, but then he realizes, look, I have put myself here, and he decides to wave the flag. Verse 2, this is his prayer. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Jonah is saying there, from the depths of the grave, he's as good as dead. He could not sink any lower. This is the worst decision. This is the worst place he's ever found himself. And in his distress, he cries out to God, and Jonah says, he heard me. He heard me. God doesn't say, no, I'm done. I've tried and you wouldn't listen. I sent the storm. You should have turned to me then. I threw you over the boat. You should have turned to me then, but you didn't. So you know what? Now that you are, I'm done. No. God doesn't do that for Jonah. Jonah cries out in distress, and God hears him. Look, I totally believe that God hears the cries of the messed up, broken, lost people. The people who have made decisions, you, me. The people who have made decisions who have put us in bad places. And we get to the end of our rope and we say, God, will you help me? And I think he does. But do you think you're too far gone? I mean, do you think you've made too many bad decisions? That you would say, look, I believe in God's grace, but I think I'm too far gone. No way could God still forgive me. No way could God still pursue me because of what I've done. This morning, I met with a woman. I went to her house, and this lady, we believe, is going to pass any moment. And she's with hospice, and she's been battling cancer for a really long time, and hasn't eaten in days, and the family's just waiting. I met with her a few months ago, and I was trying to encourage her and talk to her about God's love and grace, and she listened, and so this morning as I go over, she's somewhat with it. I just began to tell her, God is with you. God is with you. And when I said that last time, she said, Kyle, I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church. And I said, it's okay. It's okay. God is still pursuing you in these last moments of your life. God is still pursuing you. He's still pursuing you. He still wants you. His grace is still there. He is relentlessly after you. He's relentlessly after you. He hears the cry of the brokenhearted, and he responds. So you may have hit pause. You may have run away. You may think, I don't deserve it. But God loves you. God's grace, His mercy is relentlessly pursuing you. And you know what? It's not dependent on you. His love for you is not dependent on you. My son, Cade, who's 4, all of a sudden has decided that bedtime is the best time to ask theological questions, these deep spiritual questions. And so, for instance, just a couple nights ago, Cade says, so God and Jesus, is Jesus God? And I'm like, yeah, that's probably the most difficult thing to explain. Yes, Jesus is God, and there's the Father, and so I'm explaining it all, and you can see his mind just working, and he said, okay, so God and Jesus, they made everything, right? I'm like, yeah, okay, you got that. That's good. So they made Mary. Yeah, kind of in a way they made Mary, but Mary made Jesus. I'm like, you're right. That is difficult. I'm like, is this a baby question we're asking here? Is this how babies are made? I don't know. So I'm just like, yeah, that's a good question, bud. But yes, God made Mary, Mary made Jesus. It's really hard to understand. And so we wrestle that for a few moments. And these are the kind of questions my son is asking me. And so I'm about to leave him, and I said, kid, I just want you to know that there's nothing that could happen to make me love you more. And there's nothing you could do to make me love you less. He just kind of looked at me. I said, I want you to know that there's nothing that you could do. Nothing you could say, no decision you can make that would make me love you more. Nothing you could do to make me love you less. He said, huh? I said, no, there's nothing. He said, so I couldn't do anything and you would love me more? Nope. I couldn't do anything, you'd love me less? Nope. And this is what he said, I don't understand. I said, I know, buddy. We don't understand. We don't understand that this God who made us, the God of the universe who created everything, could look at us and say, there's nothing you could do to make me love you more. There's nothing you could do to make me love you less. And this is where Jonah has found himself, that he has made a decision to run from God. He is suffering the consequences. His decisions have put him in this position, and God is still after him. God is still after him. Verse 3. We'll go a little faster here. It says, you hurled me into the deep. Look, the sailors did it, but Jonah is saying, you hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. And I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountain I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, here it is again. But the Lord, but you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord, my God. Jonah's interesting. It's become a kid's story, right? We make this story into a Bible story for kids, but it's not. This is no party that Jonah's having. Have this vision of him finding a lamp somewhere and he's in the belly of this fish. He's just kind of hanging out. That's not what Jonah's saying. The water is around him. It's swirling around. Seaweed is entangled around him. He's as good as dead. He thinks he's banished from the sight of God. But you have brought my life up from the pit, O Lord, my God. God is going to go as far as he has to get Jonah back. But this wasn't fun. Now, so we talk about God's grace, but we can't talk about God's grace without talking about God's discipline. Like we like the grace side, but we don't necessarily like the discipline side. We don't like the idea that God would lovingly discipline us. I've shared this before lots of times. You've probably heard me share this story a lot, but this is the best way I can look at this idea. We have a rule in our family that the kids cannot play in the street. Right? Like that's smart. That's lovingly of me to say, Cademan, it's not wise for you to be in the street. But I promise, the moment Cade moves towards the street, the moment Cade steps into the street, there's going to be discipline. It's not because I don't want Cade to have fun. It's not because I want to be mean dad. It's because I love him. Amen. It's because I love him. It's because I want the best for him. And so I'm going to do whatever it takes. And so it's the same for Jonah. There's these consequences and there's this discipline that's happening. Look, God sent the wind and the waves. God sent the fish. He provided the fish. That may happen in your life. You may be running and there might be something that's happening that you're thinking, man, I'm in a storm. Could this be God lovingly disciplining you to come back? To acknowledge that God is with you, because our rebellion will often lead to pain. Like we talk about consequence for everyone else, but there's going to be this pain for you, this rebellion that you have. But again, the discipline doesn't change who God is. It doesn't mean he loves you less. Jim Burgeon, who's a pastor in Boulder, Colorado, he says this, our unfaithfulness to God doesn't nullify God's faithfulness. Just because you're unfaithful to God doesn't mean that now God is going to be unfaithful to you. In the midst of your unfaithfulness, God will still be faithful. Verse 7. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. And this is really big. We talk a lot about this. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. If you have a Bible, circle verse 8, underline verse 8. That this is the problem of being human. This is your problem, and this is my problem. Verse 8. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit, they give up, they exchange, they let go of the grace that could be theirs. So when Jonah runs from God, he's running to something. When you run from God, you're probably running to something. You're running to a certain pleasure or a certain lifestyle. You're running to your own ways, to your own plans, to a certain group of friends. You're running away from God, but you're running to something. And oftentimes we run to those things because we think those things will satisfy. We put our hope in those things. That's what an idol is. An idol is anything that takes the place of God, where we say, look, I'm going to give my heart there instead of giving it to God. I think this will give me everything that I need. And Jonah says, look, there's people who are clinging to those things. That is a strong word. To cleave to. The word actually means to hug. So you're holding tightly to these things that you think will satisfy you. And in doing that, you're forfeiting the grace that God has for you. This relentless grace that's coming to you, you're forfeiting it because you're holding on to something else that you think will satisfy, but it never will. It never will. Are you forfeiting it? Because here's the picture I have. Grace is not something that's hidden from you. Grace is not something that you have to go look for. You don't have to go try and find God. We use that a lot. I'm trying to find God. No, God's not hiding from you. Grace is not hiding from you. It's available to you. It's not on a carrot stick wanting you to run after it. It's there, but here's what we do. Instead of grabbing it, we grab onto other things. And we say, God, not now. Not now. Jonah says when you do that, you are forfeiting the grace that could be yours. And this is what Jonah was doing. He was exchanging something else for the grace of God, because you'll find this out week 4. This is what it was about. It was about grace and mercy, because Jonah knew who God was. Jonah knew that God was full of grace and mercy, and that's why Jonah's running. So you have to come back to find out more, but that's why he's running. And so in those moments, he's thinking, man, I personally have exchanged your grace and mercy for something else. Verse 9. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. Jonah finally gets to a point where he says, nothing else will rescue me. Nothing else will get me out of this fish. And I think, honestly, Jonah's thinking, even if I don't get out of this fish, you are all I need. And this is the question that you and I have to wrestle with right now. Do you believe that God can rescue you? Do you believe that God can save you? That his grace is for you? Do you believe that? In the midst of a storm, in the midst of your running, do you believe it? And then you cannot earn it. Just really quickly, there's a boy I've been mentoring over at Coldwater. And last week was my last week to see him for all summer. And we're talking, and out of nowhere, this little boy says, I'm scared. So what are you scared of? Well, he said, aren't you scared of anything? Don't you have any fears? I'm like, yeah, I'm afraid of heights. And I said, what are you afraid of? And he said, well, I'm afraid of bugs, and I'm afraid of dying. So our conversation went to a whole different place really, really quick. And I said, why are you afraid of dying? He goes, because I don't want to go down there. So it's a second grader. I don't want to go down there. I said, well, why do you think you'll go down there? He said, well, I've done bad things. And I said, you know what, buddy? Me too. Me too. I said, well, how do you think you go to heaven? He said, well, I got to do a bunch of good stuff. And in the conference room of Coldwater Elementary, I honestly had an opportunity to spread the gospel, to preach the gospel to this little boy. And I said, look, you have nothing to do with it. It is a free gift to you. You'd never be good enough. You're not too bad for it. That his grace is for you because God is relentlessly coming after you. Verse 10, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Jonah says, I'm done. I've waved the white flag. You are God, and you are God alone. You are all I need. And God says, yep. And he has this fish vomit Jonah onto dry land. Let's jump into chapter 3 just real quick. Greg's going to come up, and we're going to end with the song that he wrote that we looked at last week. We're going to end with that this week. But look, let's look at chapter 3, 1 through 3, just really quickly. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. God relentlessly pursued Jonah. It took a couple things. It took some loving discipline, but Jonah comes to a point where he waves the white flag and he says, God, you and you alone can save me. I surrender completely to you. God, you want me to go to Nineveh? I'm going. I'm going. What is it for you? What is it for you? Have you ever taken that step and said, God, you are the only one who can rescue me? That I want to, for the first time, believe in your forgiveness and your grace, that salvation comes from you and you alone, that I can be in right standing with you, God, because of Jesus. Have you done that? Have you verbalized that to God? Not that you have to walk an aisle or kneel at an altar, but have you done that? If not, maybe today's that day where you say, man, I'm in the midst of a storm. I'm in the midst of chaos. Today is the day where I say, God, will you rescue me? Maybe you've done that at some point, and then at some point you hit pause or you've been running and you know what God wants you to do. He knows, you know he wants you to go a different path. He knows, you know he wants you to stop doing something. What is it for you? Maybe it's in these moments you wave your own white flag and you say, God, I'm done. And the only reason we do that is because God is relentlessly pursuing you. That his grace is relentless. It's never ending. It doesn't run out on you. So would you stand? And if you, in these moments, feel like you need to come down and pray at an altar, you can. There's nothing magical here, but it is this moment of stepping outside of where you are and saying, God, I need you. And you can come. No one's going to come pray with you. No one's going to bother you. This is a moment for you. In your seat, maybe you want to wave the white flag in your heart and say, God, this is it. But either way, would you sing along with us this morning about this relentless grace and love of God?